Helland and David Wemhoff on the show Israel. We're going to call it Dobbs, Kennedy, and the Basis of Law. I'm going to throw in a scripture here, and maybe Dave can weave around it or ignore it. But I do think it's, in my mind, the basis of law does touch on this. This is Esther, and the king had a 180-day party, and his queen had a 7-day party at the end, and the king commanded, by his eunuchs, he commanded the queen to come to his party, and she said, no, I'm not going to come. And so the wise men, the 7 wise men, gathered around the king, and the king said, well, what do you think, guys? This is serious. What should we do? What should, King says, according to the law, he asked the 7 wise men, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs? Then Memucan, the leading one, said, not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be altered, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. Of course, that was Esther. So the decree made by the king is So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, vast as it is, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low. This advice pleased the king and the officials, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in his own script, and to every people in his own language, declaring that every man should be master in his own house. Okay, and the book of Sirach has many chapters on the good wife, the evil wife. And it says, if she does not go as you direct, separate her from yourself. Okay, so there's this strong place in the law that the wife is to obey the husband. And I got a call from a fellow that used to live in this area, and a lot of people kind of knew him. And he had been married 3 years. I missed the wedding. I was going to try to make the wedding. And he happens to be, because of his job, he happens to be in Portland right now. Downtown, he said he's downtown Portland. And
how's that going?
Well, he was talking to the policeman, and the policeman said, this is like the Roman Empire falling. And my friend says, no, it's fallen. Okay.
It's fallen?
It's fallen as far as Portland. He says the ghost town is just terrible. It's just terrible homelessness. It's just total lawlessness in his mind. And so I heard a guy give a lecture saying that in his mind, the reason for the fall of the Roman Empire is that the fathers were no longer ruling their homes. Okay, so the issue is what's you got Dobbs, Kennedy, and the basis of law. And of course, I'm concerned like law at key points. You know, what's the government's view of the home? In other words, this huge kingdom, the Media-Persian kingdom, which was huge, that decree went to a huge area. And the king thought, this is critical. If you don't get this command out, the 7 wise men, your kingdom is in trouble. It's going to be nothing but wrath and contempt, and it's going to destabilize your kingdom, and you don't know what will happen. So he gave one command: the men are masters of the home. That was critical that he do that. So in other words, if you live in a country where the men are not masters of the home, that implies something bad. Okay. So the basis of our law regarding things like that, what is the basis? So that's what we're trying to see what you have to say, because people, whatever you're saying, people are going to take it and apply it to where they're at, okay? I'm interested in this kind of thing, but what you're going to say is going to apply to a lot of things.
Well, you're reading from the book of Esther in the Bible. You know the Old Testament. You probably know the New Testament better than me. So in Esther, that was the king of Persia, right?
Yeah, he was the head of the Persian Mede Empire.
Persian Mede. Okay, so and his wife was the queen.
Yeah,
and she didn't show up when he told her to, right?
Oh yeah, he sent his eunuchs, and they said the king commands you to come.
Okay. So and she didn't make it.
She refused to come, and the wise men said, "Hold it here. When the other women here, the women that were there were, wives of the officials. But when they went back home, every woman in the kingdom was going to find out. This is huge. This is like the biggest scandal of the decade. And when the women hear that she refused to come, they're no longer going to be looking at their husbands with honor and obedience. They're going to start looking at their husbands with some disrespect."
So are you saying then that the king's words were law? They were law, that she had to come with him, and that everybody in the kingdom was supposed to do what he said?
He set the pattern, so the king, in the American Revolution, the best scholars that I read, when in order to dethrone King George, they had to first dethrone God. But it was a domino effect. That was dethroning the father in the home too. So it set in motion a dethroning of all the authority.
So the order that the king gave, whatever the Persian Mede king's name was, that arose from his own authority, from the natural law, from God's law? Where did that arise?
I would say it's natural law. It's for sure it's God's law. Okay, because King David had authority from God to command, and people had to obey. Obviously, you have to disobey a sinful command and risk martyrdom, because you had that in Daniel. But natural law implies an order also. But divine law does support the husband, definitely supports the husband being the master of the home. But also probably the natural law does.
So in ancient Israel, I mean, you know how that was set up. Like I said, you probably know it better than me. So in ancient Israel, you had the kings, and then you had the priests, right, with the temple.
Yeah.
So how did that work? Did the priests tell the kings what to do?
It started out with Samuel. Samuel was the prophet, no kings at all. Okay. And then when the people saw that Samuel's sons were not up for the task, they kind of panicked, and they wanted to have a king like the other nations. So they pleaded with Samuel, "Give us a king." Samuel goes to God, and God says, "Yeah, they're rejecting me. But let them have a king, and let them know it's not going to be that good." In fact, in the book of Sirach, it says there were only 3 kings. The King James version of Sirach, Ecclesiasticus, says there was only 3 kings that were not defective: David, Hezekiah, and Josiah. So all the other kings were bad. And so it was better.
Why were they bad?
Didn't follow the law of God. That was how they saw them as bad. Some were better than others, but only 3 followed it the way they should have. Because that's the temptation on a king, is to deviate off the law of God for various reasons.
There's probably a lot of reasons, a lot of political reasons, a lot of personal, economic reasons to deviate. But what you're setting out is the principle that the rulers are supposed to follow the law of God.
Absolutely, and that's why the kings went under severe training. England and France are the countries we see the most, but their history has strong history. In France, it was the Delphine would mentor the oldest son, and it was very serious mentoring so that the king would learn how to operate on the law of God.
That was part of his education. It was just kind of drilled into him because he was the hereditary ruler. He was gonna come in and take over.
The blessing on the kingdom would depend on how close they followed God. The curse on the kingdom would happen to the degree they fell away from the law of God. So you wanted a king that was very concerned about being holy and ruling justly.
So the kings ruled the material realm in accordance with God's law. So that would have had material ramifications, right? And also spiritual ramifications for the people under his command, right?
Yeah.
And then comes John Locke, right? With his letter on toleration.
Right, with a bunch of other people that were writing at the same time. But
That's right.
But he got dominance, or he was more out there in the open.
He got backing by Lord Ashley and some of the elites and
Right, but he wasn't the
in
only
England.
one saying this, but people started saying these things.
right. But he says that the civil magistrate is there just for material reasons, totally divorced from the religious people who are there for the reason to save your soul. The civil magistrate is there to protect life, liberty, property, that kind of stuff. But the two shall never meet.
Right, so before that, the civil magistrate would only be put there ideally because he was going to be ruling based on the law of God, or he wouldn't be put there. Now there's a shift. They're not going to be watching him so close, whether he's ruling by the law of God.
That's right, right.
Okay, they're not going to go away from it too quick because they're so used to being operating on the law of God, but he's not paying attention to that as much anymore.
So one of the guys who followed Locke was James Madison, right? He bought into what a lot
I think
of what
a lot
Locke
of it.
said.
Of course, he was tutored by John Knox Witherspoon, who was a good theologian, president of Princeton. But Witherspoon he had a grudge. You know, the Anglicans put him in prison. The English put him in prison in Scotland because he was a Presbyterian.
Right, the Anglicans that's the Church of England. They always were fighting the Presbyterians, which are the Scottish
Right.
Protestants.
Right, and then the British called the American Revolution the Presbyterian
The
Revolt.
Presbyterian Revolt, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
But John Knox disagreed with Calvin. Calvin was his boss, so to speak. He was under Calvin. All 13 colonies were Calvinists. But Knox came up with a radical notion of the right of revolution. Okay.
Well, this is a few centuries earlier, and that's in Europe, Switzerland.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because I mean Witherspoon is called John Knox Witherspoon.
It's because he studied.
Scotland was their guy was John Knox, where Calvin was in Geneva. So Europe was the main base of Europe was Calvinist, but Scotland really went after followed John Knox.
Right.
But he had a great influence on the American Revolution.
Witherspoon did.
Witherspoon and Knox.
And John Knox.
Because they applied Knox's justification for revolution, which Calvin would never agreed with.
And what was that justification?
Well, it loosened it up. You had greater possibilities, so they could say, well, we're justified here in this case, with the American, with the king the way he is and the way Parliament is, we feel we're justified, and they leaned on Knox to make that justification. But I think Knox was off on his own. I don't see. I mean, Calvin was already off base some in my mind. So Knox was way off base from historical Orthodox Christianity.
Well, okay, but Knox says you have a right to throw off tyrants, right?
True, but even Witherspoon and John Adams said King George was not a tyrant. So now it becomes just call somebody a tyrant, and that proves he's a tyrant.
Well, that was the Declaration of Independence. So you had a list of grievances against the king and against the English rulers.
Yeah, written by probably Thomas Jefferson. Some people say Thomas Paine might have wrote it.
Well,
But they were pretty similar anyway.
they had some pretty radical ideas. They believed in separation of church and state. Both of them did. Right? They believed in that wall of separation.
Yeah, because they were both, I mean, Thomas Paine wrote The Rights of Man and After Common Sense
Right.
and the Age of Reason.
Right.
And they were both severely attacking Christianity.
Right.
and Thomas Jefferson wrote his own Bible and left out the miracles. Okay. So
I
I'm just
think
saying
I think he left out the miracle, but he kept Jesus in, right?
Yeah, but what kind of Jesus?
Well, it sounds like a natural Jesus.
Yes.
So, well, I think. So what are we talking about? The interplay between church and state. You know, that's what we're dealing with, right? Mm-hmm. What's the interplay here? So, we call this Dobbs, Kennedy, and the basis of the law. And so Dobbs is the case that overturned Roe versus Wade, and Casey versus Planned Parenthood came down June 24, about 3 weeks ago. And then Kennedy was the case that came out the following Monday that a lot of people have ignored.
Yeah, you don't hear about.
You don't hear anything, but I think it's a very significant case because they talk about this idea of church and state, okay? They talk about this idea of church and state, and that's very important. Dobbs, as a lot of the listeners probably already know, basically said there's no right to an abortion because the substantive due process clause and the 14th Amendment's liberty clause don't include that. Now, in order for them to get to that point, as you know, the Supreme Court had to go back and look at American law, you know, in the 1700s and the 1800s, okay? They had to analyze that. So that brought this whole experiment back in line with its roots.
Which they don't do that often, apparently.
They don't do it often. And really, Dobbs' decision is a big decision because it calls into question a lot of other decisions.
So once they make that decision and the rationale is solid, then other cases that fall outside of that are now questioned.
They're all questioned, exactly. Because the other cases that depended on substantive due process that we've seen in our lifetime in the last 50, 60 years, they're up for grabs now. They're up for a closer analysis of American law, American tradition, American history. And America came from England. So America took the common law with it. Some call it the ius commune. That's what Professor Vermeulen from Harvard calls it. And it is a combination of local law, which is the English kings, the English barons and dukes. It's a combination of Roman law from the time of the Roman Empire, and it's a combination of canon law, which is church law. And Madison knew about the common law, and Jefferson knew about the common law.
Oh yeah, Madison was tutored under Witherspoon, and they say another extra year under Witherspoon. So I'm astonished how he kind of did his own thing. So
they did do their own thing, and maybe we can talk about why they did it. But what was interesting was what was said by Madison to Washington, and I give credit here to Professor David Thomas Koenig. He's a professor emeritus now. I forget the institution he's at, and also I give credit to Professor Lance Banyan, who's passed away, is at the University of Kentucky. But Professor Koenig talks about a statement from Madison to George Washington made in 1787, October of 1787. He said, quote, "Had Americans declared the common law to be in force, it would have brought over from Great Britain 1,000 heterogeneous and anti-republican doctrines, and even the ecclesiastical hierarchy itself, for that is part of the common law," end of quote. So Madison and Jefferson both knew, oh man, we've got to do something about the common law. So Jefferson stepped down from the Continental Congress, I believe in August, September of 1776, and he said, we've got to devise a new system here that doesn't bring in all these church influences, all these what we would call authoritarian influences of the English common law. Because if you look at Blackstone's Book 4, it talks about the rights of ecclesiastical authorities, the church, and also talks about there will be no criticism of the Christian religion. And by implication, the Christian religion is the basis of our laws. Well, these guys didn't want that, okay? And so this was really a break from England. So this is kind of where we are now as we look back on the common law.
Is there a way to get in their head and figure out why did they want that break?
Well, I just have a theory.
Okay.
And my theory is what was put forth, by someone else, Professor Amatore Fanfani, an Italian. He died in 1999. He was a professor. He was into politics. He was premier president of Italy all throughout the 20th century. But my theory is that you have to, the capitalist spirit wants to gain money or property and wants to enjoy it. That's what he said. And that spirit has always sought to tear down barriers not of its making. I've said this before on your show, but it's always sought to tear down those barriers not of its making. Okay. And so that's where the Masons also come in. Everybody blames the Masons. Well, the Masons basically helped to tear down those barriers to this capitalistic or commercial spirit. Thomas Pownall, and I may have mentioned his name before or not, had a brother called John Pownall. John Pownall worked in the English Board of Trade, which was the brains of the English mercantilist system. America was a colony. It was a third world country back in the 1700s, okay? But the elites in America understood the potential in commerce. They understood the potential in wealth in this country with lands and furs and crops and whatever, minerals and so on and so forth. And Pownall said in one of his writings, Memorial to the Sovereigns of America, and also again, Memorials to the Sovereigns of Europe, that he wrote in 1780, and these were reprinted over the years. But he said, the basis of this revolution is commerce. It's about commerce.
And then can that be broken down even more? In other words,
it's about wealth. It's about wealth. The American Revolution was largely, I think it was inspired and driven primarily by a desire to throw off a mercantilist system, which England had opposed on the colonies.
Now, how would you describe a mercantilist system as opposed to what they wanted?
The American leadership wanted their own economy. They wanted to control the trade. A mercantilist system means that you use the colonies for the benefit of the mother country. So the raw materials came out of America to England where they were manufactured and given value and then either sold back to the colonies or sold to Europe or other countries. The colonists were restricted with whom they could share or trade their goods, okay? Elbridge Gerry was an American founder. He signed the Declaration. I think he refused to sign the Constitution.
Did he?
Yeah, because it didn't have the Bill of Rights yet. And he said, yeah, I like the idea of breaking up government and making it just strong enough to protect and defend our commercial interests. But we need something that protects us against the government that wants to silence us and religions that want to hurt us. He was a merchant, and he was hurt, like a lot of other American merchants, by the Stamp Act, the Molasses Act, the Sugar Act, all those things we learned in grade school. Their industries were hurt. They couldn't trade as freely as they wanted to, and they didn't make as much money. Okay, so this is what Pownall saw.
The British would say that's a type of a tax. In other words, this has to be, for the sake of the strength of the mother country, this is what we have to do. Did the British have an argument? I mean, was there a legitimate legal argument? I mean, as far as the welfare of the mother country, or was the British? Did you think the British had a solid?
Well, that was the system at the time, and they were acting in accordance with every other country that had a colony. Spain had colonies, Portugal had colonies. That's kind of how they did it.
So they weren't that unusual.
They were not that unusual. I think probably Spain and Portugal were a lot more draconian in the way they dealt with their colonies than the British were. But the British were operating from an economic mindset that treated America as a source of raw materials, okay? And they had debts to pay. England had debts to pay after the 7 Years' War, and they owed bankers in Holland and in England, and so they had to get the money somehow.
But that war was fought primarily on behalf of the colonists.
It was to protect the American colonies and then to take the French colonies that were in the New World, and the British got those colonies, and then there was some stuff going on the continent too, which dealt with power, shifting power relations.
And the colonists hadn't been paying that many taxes up till that point, and British said, you're going to have to start paying more taxes.
You have to pay more taxes, and that hurt.
To cover the cost of that war.
To cover the cost. That hurt the merchants. But the merchants were also restricted on who they could deal with. And they saw rich markets to the south, in the Indies, in the Spanish countries. They saw rich markets. They couldn't sail that way. They couldn't go that way. And so they said, well, we got to do something about this. And I think this was a very strong driving force. And so you had this idea as America started where, what's the law? How are we going to form the law? And what's going to be the basis of the law? And so
but they're thinking,
this thinking.
In order to enhance what I want. In other words, what they wanted was commerce, and they wanted trade. They wanted to pursue wealth.
Yeah, I think that the leaders of the American Revolution did care about the American people, but they also were motivated by this desire for wealth. I think the big fight in history is either, service to God or service to wealth. It's either love of God or love of wealth. I think that's the big
politicians
fight.
in Washington D.C. have a concern for their people, but they also seem to get very wealthy when they're over there in D.C.
Well, that's what a lot of people have noted, and a lot of people wonder how that can be. Is that a good thing? But the Kennedy case came up and dealt with school prayer. Okay. So this is where we get into the establishment or disestablishment clause of the First Amendment, the relation between religion and the law, the relation between church and state. Because people are talking about this now. Representative Boebert, I know a lot of people think she's nuts, but she's saying, the church should tell the state what to do. General Flynn a few months back said, we need a state church. We all need to have the state church. So you're seeing people asking this question. You're seeing Patrick Deneen at the University of Notre Dame saying why liberalism failed. And, it's a brilliant book. And he says liberalism failed because it worked the way it was supposed to, which was, it was basically, supposed to break everything up. And as I read between the lines, to create a system that benefits the commercial, the financial interests, because it eliminates church and religion from interfering with state decisions and as the basis of the law.
No. In other words, Coolidge said the business of America is business. But the problem, if that's the main game, is business, in the long run, there's going to be a few winners.
Well, you're going to see a concentration of wealth and a concentration of power.
Because that's almost inevitable unless the government's strong enough to regulate it.
Unless the government is there to control the various interests for the benefit of everyone. Section 2304 of the Catechism says, peace, peace is the tranquility of right order, or is the tranquility of order. So there has to be an order. So the Catholic faith has always taught that, and I talk about that in my book, the 2-volume book, that the law is supposed to be based on the divine positive law of Jesus Christ, which is the Catholic faith. Okay, so this separation of church and state, which is at the heart of the First Amendment, keeps that apart. We saw that in decisions in the past with Lawrence versus Texas, but the Kennedy case is really important because the Kennedy case, in my view, and I'm not a constitutional law scholar, I just read this and I take a look at it in view of what I've learned in the past. The Kennedy case is actually saying we're dealing with a situation where we really have to limit the attacks on the establishment of religion. So they lay out the reasons, cases where we have establishment of religion and it's not good. So there's Lee versus Wiseman, where a rabbi got up and gave a prayer at a school graduation. Everybody had to listen to it. And they said that is coercion, that's against the Establishment Clause. And then there are other cases that they cited where there was a school prayer that everyone had to listen to who went to a ball game. And so they're saying that you're coercing people to go along with this. But they really have distanced themselves. I think they've thrown out the Lemon versus Kurtzman test, which is to take a look at each statute and say, is this does this have a secular purpose or not? Is it advancing a secular or rather a religious purpose or not? So you're getting into this interplay between church and state and religion and the basis of the laws. This is the struggle that I think is going on in America right now. And I think that this court under Roberts has indicated that it is willing to entertain people going into the public sphere and saying, you know, we're Christians here. Our Christianity teaches us that this is how the law should be. Now, that's quite a difference from Lawrence v. Texas, which we've talked about before, where, you know, in the footnote, I mean, it's really some strong language. That opinion was written by Justice Kennedy, writing against the law about condemning homosexual sodomy. He said, the condemnation has been shaped by religious beliefs, conceptions of right and acceptable behavior. The issue is what the majority is. The issue is whether the majority may use the power of the state to enforce these views on the whole of society through the operation of criminal law. But we have an emerging awareness that liberty gives substantial protection to adult persons to deciding how to conduct their private lives in a matter pertaining to sex. So Lawrence v. Texas, 2003, you really have a break from American history and the will of the American people, who are mostly Christian, who voted these laws because of the common law, because of their experience with England, because of their religious beliefs. And you got Justice Kennedy in 2003 saying, oh no, you know, we know better than you. We've got an emerging idea of liberty. We're breaking that off right here and right now. So why would they do that? Why would they do that? And I think that the issue goes back to something that goes back to our founding. And once again, the Kennedy case said we have to look at the founding, we have to look at what the founders thought, what they thought about, why there has to be anti-establishment laws and all of that. And so we have to take a look at what Madison said. And, you know, Madison wrote a letter. He wrote the Remonstrance in 1785 against an established church in Virginia. And he said a number of things. He said, basically, you know, religion is the duty we owe to the Creator. It's a private thing. We can't have, you know, the religion imposed on people. That would be tyranny. And he said the civil magistrate is not competent as a judge of religious truth. Religion is an engine of civil policy, and it's an unhallowed perversion of the means of salvation to base policy on religion. He then went on and talked about ecclesiastical establishments get weak when you combine church and state. But, you know, the issue, you got to keep your eye on the ball. And the issue is, you know, basing the laws on some sense of morality, either from the natural law or from religion, from, you know,
the divine positive
from
law.
the divine positive law, which is the Catholic view. So Madison wrote a letter, which in 1st of April of 1774, and what he sets out, I believe, is the dynamic, the real dynamic behind the First Amendment. Okay, and I think the disestablishment clause, and that is, he's writing to his friend William Bradford. He says, you are happy in dwelling, this is April 1st, 1774. You are happy in dwelling in a land, Bradford lived in Pennsylvania, where those inestimable privileges are fully enjoyed, and public has long felt the good effects of their religious as well as civil liberty. Foreigners have been encouraged to settle among you. Industry and virtue have been promoted by mutual emulation and mutual inspection. Commerce and the arts have flourished. I cannot help attributing those continual exertions of genius which appear among you to the inspiration of liberty and that love of fame and knowledge which always accompanies it. Religious bondage shackles and debilitates the mind and unfits it for every noble enterprise, every expanded prospect. How far this is the case with Virginia will more clearly appear when the ensuing trial is made. So what he did was, he's basically saying, you know, if you have religious liberty, you can have more industry. Businesses are going to want to go where you are. Okay, and he said that again in the Remonstrance.
Because religious liberty means you're not restricted by the divine positive law.
You're not shackled by the divine positive law. The disestablishment clause of the Constitution says you're not supposed to base the laws on religion. Now, the First Amendment, as originally written, was directed to the national government. Okay, but the states, it can be argued, did not follow that for a very long time. They got rid of their state churches. Those went away because what you had was this clear teaching from the higher society, the national society, to the state society, saying we want disestablishment, because it's good for business. So the state churches ultimately went away, but the laws were still.
Massachusetts was like last one, 1833 or something like that.
Massachusetts was last, 1833. But the states still had this idea of common law. They still had this idea of Christianity informing their laws. Mm-hmm. Okay, now that all changed, with Everson in 1947.
But it was proceeding up to there.
Proceeding up to there, the states generally followed in large measure the common law, and also they follow in large measure what the religions want, what was kind of agreed among the religions.
But the states,
in many ways.
The states lost a lot with the Civil War because the states' rights was.
Well, you had the 14th Amendment due process, which was applied, which was used to take the First Amendment and apply to the states, beginning with Gitlow in 1925, and then that said, in general, you can incorporate the First Amendment, apply it to the states, and not just limit it to the national. So what you have here, and that is still, pretty much the law. I mean, it still applies to the states. The First Amendment still applies to the states, but that's subject, I think, in some people's view, to some review. But whether that happens or not, we don't know. But what Dobbs did is they threw the idea back down to the states. This is federalism in action. Let the states figure it out. These other decisions, gay marriage, homosexual sodomy, other stuff, this stuff could go back to the states for the states to decide. But I think you still have a fundamental question, which is what are the laws going to be based on? Can you base your laws, because the majority are Christians, they say we want these laws based on the divine positive law of Jesus Christ. Oh, and by the way, it's good for people too, which is kind of what Lawrence versus Texas alluded to. Yeah, you can use religion or morality, but you got to have another reason, okay? So, can you do that? Or can you avoid having those laws being struck down? I think that is a struggle that's going on. I think Professor Vermeulen takes a look at the Constitution and says, I think we can tweak this thing if we go back to common law jurisdiction, which is the common good constitutionalism that he talks about in his book that came out earlier this year. And it's called it's called common good constitutionalism, where you have certain principles that are inherent in the common law and in the civil law, which mandate how everything's supposed to be. What Vermeulen says is, he says, the idea of originalism versus progressivism, they say Scalia and Thomas got originalism, and I don't know, Breyer, who's off the bench now, but Kennedy and Breyer had progressivism, right? Living document. He says that's really all positivism. They need to go back to the principles that underlie, and have always underlied, the civil law and the common law, and work from those first principles. Hadley Ark said about the same thing about a year and a half ago, I believe it was, in an editorial to the Wall Street Journal. He said there are first principles that come before even constitutional law.
But they were able to do this because Trump put Kavanaugh, Barrett, and Gorsuch on there, and they sided with Thomas and Alito.
Well,
right?
That's the great legacy of Trump. That's the great legacy of Trump, is that he was able to put three justices up there and they took a look at history, and they said, we look at history and it just isn't there. You guys, in a way, you can say the First Amendment, okay, the First Amendment and the ideas that came with republicanism in this country broke America away from the European tradition. And then you can say, in a way, the second revolution happened in our lifetimes, with beginning with Everson and that whole line of cases, continuing up to Obergefell, breaking us further away from the will of the people, and the common law, whatever was left from the common law, was broken even further. I think you can make that argument. And I submit that the main argument is that it benefits the powerful private interests, the economic interests. I think liberalism is in trouble in this society. Patrick Deneen's written about it. Other people have talked about it. I think it's in trouble. But the principles of liberalism are still being pushed around the globe. And I think that's the pushback you're getting from Russia and from China.
Well, Putin just came out, I mean, this is what I read this morning even. He came out and said American international hegemony is over. It's over. America is, they can't win, they're going to lose, and...
well, I'm not going to agree with that.
No, but I'm just saying...
I'm not agreeing with that.
But this is the battle, though.
It is the battle. I mean, Michael Hudson has written about it. This is a civilizational battle. So, this brings us to the next point, which you're absolutely correct. And there's an international component to this fight in the United States over first principles. Mm-hmm. There's an international component to it. And what we talk about today, yeah, it's addressed to the people in the community, and it's whoever watching and whoever's on whatever, the internet or whatever, and the American people, but it's also addressed to the leadership of the Catholic Church. Okay, the Catholic Church is the oldest international organization on earth. Did you know that? It is the oldest international organization on earth. It is in every town. It's very powerful. And while it may not have supported the pro-life movement strongly, what support it gave had an impact on what happened. And people know that.
Oh, yeah.
People know that. They know that the Catholic Church is the center of the chessboard.
And when Notre Dame decided to go to D.C., you pointed out that Father Jenkins, when he made that move to openly support the pro-life movement there in Washington.
That was huge. That was huge in the autumn of 2009. I think that was huge. I think that was a breaking.
So that's the Catholic Church at its, what a lot of people consider their most prominent university, putting its weight behind.
Well, I think that's right. I think people considered it the most prominent Catholic university and had a great deal of influence. How people looked at the church, and it had a lot of influence within the church. So, I wrote down some notes. I want to make sure I covered the key points. So, the Catholic Church, my book documents how the Catholic leadership basically came to accept John Courtney Murray's, I call it heresy, for lack of his whole view that the First Amendment is based on the natural law, and it's the ideal. The leadership accepted it. The doctrine never accepted it. It is still the divine positive law. We have an obligation to base the laws on the divine positive law of Jesus Christ, which is the Catholic faith. That is the obligation to do that. Monsignor Shea, as I discuss, didn't even support Murray. He said Murray's idea of natural law is wrong. We've seen this whole conception of natural law that Murray talked about falling apart. The Heritage Foundation just did something on Lawler. I can't remember if it's Philip Lawler or Peter Lawler, but on the Lawler who died 5 years ago, just did something on him saying, he's dead. He tried to repackage and find the basis for Catholics to support the American experiment. And what they're finding out, like Michael Hanby found out and wrote about a year and a half in New Polity magazine, brilliant article. What they're finding out is, and he wrote in rebuttal to Bob Riley, Voice of America director, who defended America. What they're finding out is that the American principles that were enunciated by guys like Jefferson and Madison, they're not supportable in Catholic doctrine. There was a natural law, there was a common law, and there have been attempts throughout American history to destroy that link to the West. Okay, and Professor Vumuli says it happened later in the 1800s. I think it started a lot earlier, but he's a Harvard professor. I'm a local guy. So I think it started a lot earlier with the actions with the First Amendment by Jim Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And they said, we got a problem here, Houston, with the common law.
Right, so they wanted, well, like Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, he tricked a lot of Christians to think that this was justified. They tried to act like that Christians could support that. And you're saying a Catholic that knows his doctrine could not support that.
Could not support it. And so you got separation of church and state, right? So my book talks, a 2-volume, get it on Amazon.com, 2-volume. So, they talk about separation of church and state, right? Well, doctrinal warfare was directed by the government at the churches. And that is one of the principles that everybody agrees with. The government should not tamper with the doctrine of religions. That's a violation of separation of church, but doctrinal warfare and the actions of the powerful private interests through the media and the U.S. government was a direct attack on the principles of the religions to get them to support America as organized, basically separation of church and state. where you can, even prayer breakfasts, you can argue, are attempts to define the doctrine of the churches. And nobody, people are, so what do you base the laws on? You base the laws on God's law, like we started out talking about.
Right, and I would say that even the idea of public school, which is government, the idea of government school, the idea is wrong, because automatically they're going to be violating your religious doctrine because of the practice of it.
Well, you have conflicting rights. So in Indiana, all the constitutions and all the states and all the 50 states have got God in their constitution. But like we were talking, they don't mention Jesus Christ, and they're all thanking God. And in America and in Indiana, you've got thank God, and we want morals.
Oh, yeah.
And you got to act on your conscience. So if your conscience tells you, we need to change the law in our states. I mean, federalism, is getting a little stronger here with Dobbs and Kennedy. If we want to change the laws in our states, to make them more in line with religion, I can advocate for that. And if the majority of the people vote for that, then why can't we have that?
That's what your state is able to do. A lot of people get confused by the word federalism because it implies Washington, D.C. and the federal government, but it doesn't. Federalism implies more rights to the states. Ironically.
It's some power to the states, it's some power to the national government. And the national government took over international commerce and interstate commerce, which is huge. It took over the currency. They took over the intellectual property. They took over the Army, the Navy, okay? That's huge. That gives you the structures, and they protected contracts and they protected property rights, okay? That's the big one. That's the real sleeper that people miss, okay? So those 5, 6 things establish a very strong central government by which you could have a strong economy to build in the United States, develop what some people have called capitalism, develop an economy where we're masters of our own fate, okay? So the issue, and I am by no means, saying I know the answer to this. I'm saying that there is an issue, how will the court react if people say, we have our religious beliefs, we're not going to establish a state church, but we're going to base the laws on our religion? I mean, is this going to be considered a direct affront of the Establishment Clause? There's some suggestion to say that we might be able to do this, that we're being invited to do this.
Well, this is pushback against Lawrence versus Texas.
This is pushback against Lawrence, which is decided on due process grounds, 14th Amendment due process ground, and it showed an antipathy towards Christianity with that statement by Kennedy in the footnote.
Because this is when I was there at the January 6th prayer meeting there in D.C. I mean, there's different ways of saying it, but probably the consensus was probably 80% were Christians, and that's what they wanted. They wanted to see our system, the laws of that system, somehow get back
right
in harmony with the teachings of Christ in some way at all. We have gone so far off. Right. How can we get it back?
Right, because there's an idea that the law is supposed to serve virtue, that the law is supposed to help all of us. And Vermeulen says it very well. He says, but Vermeulen's only interested in the material aspect, which I find fault with that, because you also have to worry about the spiritual aspect of people with your laws. You have to, society is there to build virtue. That's Catholic doctrine, section 1895.
Well, there's also the idea there's a curse on the land. If there's sin in the land, and certain types of sin are going to bring a curse, and certain types of behavior bring a blessing. So the government should be concerned about that.
The government, the development of people, whether it is national or international, is supposed to be of their material status and of their spiritual, which means in line with the truth.
Well, like going back to Esther, the oldest book in the Bible supposedly is Job. And the first thing Job does, the first paragraph of Job, he was concerned about the spiritual condition of his children. And he was concerned that maybe they're doing something that could bring God's curse. So he'd get up early every morning, offer up sacrifices to God to cover his children, to protect them. Well, he's the father. The government is supposed to operate similarly.
Right, and everybody who was involved in all these traditional family movements and pro-life movement that you and I were all part of at some point for some time, everybody was operating from the view, this is wrong. It's morally wrong, Okay, so we need to put morality there. So people always ask me, so what are things supposed to look like? We have a common acquaintance who sent us something about Oliveira Salazar's Portugal and their little book. And it's actually a very interesting book because it turned me on to the Portuguese Constitution from 1933. Of course, that was thrown out in the Carnation Revolution of 1974. But it talked about the different aspects of their constitution. It didn't say this is a Catholic Confessional State. It just said we got a treaty with the Catholic Church. Oh, and by the way, in the Constitution, these are all the things we're going to protect and defend. It's all morality. It's kind of like they lifted it from Rerum Novarum and from other aspects of Catholic doctrine, and they put it in there. And they said, this is what we're going to defend because it's good for the people. Okay, so that's one example, all right? They said, and by the way, we allow other religions, but you guys can't interfere with morality, okay? Mm-hmm. See, and this is what Dignitas Humanae said. Dignitas Humanae, and this is also in the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
And I also heard Portugal was a great place to live.
A great place to live, yeah.
I mean, it was an ideal state. Some people were telling me years back.
Well, I'm sure it is. But, I've never been there. But, what you've got, what you've got is you've got Dignitas Humanae said the common good has got to be protected. It's the sum total of those conditions by which people can more fully realize their vocation. Okay, which means that it's the material and the spiritual. So I looked up another country. There's only one country in the whole world that is considered a Catholic confessional state. Now, there are like 20 countries, according to the Pew Research Center. Those guys do great research. But there's like 20 countries that favor the Catholic Church. But I think that Costa Rica is about the only one that really actually establishes the Catholic Church, the Catholic Confessional State. It says the Catholic Church, it says right here, Article 75, the Roman Catholic Apostolic religion is that of the state, which contributes to its maintenance without preventing the free exercise in the Republic, of other beliefs that do not oppose themselves to the universal morality or good customs.
As long as they do not oppose
That's right.
what we hold to be the moral law.
As long as they don't oppose the moral law and the good customs, which is how people regulate their material activities with each other. I mean, you guys can have disagreements on doctrine, that's fine. But you know what? We're going to have a baseline here of morality.
Well, that's similar to Putin's position on homosexuality. You're free to be a homosexual, but you're not allowed to oppose and propagate against basically their state church. You're not allowed.
You're not allowed to hurt the morals of society.
Yes.
And you're not allowed to attack the doctrine of the state church. And religious liberty, the proper relation of church and state has always been in the Catholic formulation that the church is the higher society over the state because they're responsible for people's souls. So they're not like telling the president what to do, but they're telling you what the doctrine is. And, President Kennedy, you got to follow it. You can't go to Houston and say, I'm not going to follow my religious roots. That's Joe Biden, okay? That's Mario Cuomo. But the Catholic leadership in this country allowed that to happen over a long period of time. And I'm talking about the prelates, the bishops, the cardinals.
But they're not looking at the big picture. You have Israel, the people of God went into the land of Canaan, and God told them it's not because of your righteousness, it's because of how wicked it is here in the land of Canaan, and I'm going to remove them. But if you ever become wicked like them, I'll remove you.
And this is what you have said before, and this is what Dignitas Humanae says too. The Declaration of Religious Liberty out of Vatican II. It says, if you believe in something, you got to live it in all aspects of your life, right? Mm-hmm. If you believe in a religion with the morality, you've got to live it, and you've got to conduct yourself that way. We all fall short in that, but the reality is that's a dynamic. It's called integrity, okay? It's called integrity. And Inter Mirifica is there to make sure, especially in social communications, that people in the media and in entertainment follow that. Because you really started to see a lot of the morals go when the U.S. Supreme Court said in the Miracle case from 1952, Wilson versus Burston, they said, oh no, you know what, motion pictures are they're like political speech. Well, they always used to be economic speech, right? That could be limited for the morality of people. Okay, that's a huge shift that happened in 52.
They said
and that
they
affected
called it
morality.
Political speech. I remember I was on the bus traveling with somebody, and here was this Muslim lady, and the buses have movies, and the movie was terrible. You know, it was immoral. And I'm not looking at that stupid thing. Well, here's this devout-looking Muslim staring at this, you know, soaking in this immoral movie, totally contradicting her beliefs. You could have no respect for her.
The religion gives the principles of action, okay? Then the civil authorities are there to make sure their conduct is within those principles, okay? They have to make prudential judgments on specific things. Do we paint the fire engines red? What are all the factors here for going to war against Mexico, you know, or whoever? And so, you know, let's take a look at that, you know, and how should we conduct our foreign policy? Because what happens within a nation affects the relations between nations, and there is a connection there, okay? There's a very important connection between national law and international law, and maybe we'll talk about international law another
But right
time.
now, we're not showing integrity. Right now, we constantly are contradicting ourselves, and so that people now are questioning what are our values and what's the basis of our law.
Right, and it's grievous, and it's really grievous because people love this country, and they love the people, and they want what's best for them.
Right, and so this is a good time for people to really dig in and what is the basis of law? And like you were saying, you have the power in your state to move things in the direction that conform to the religion of the people of that state.
I think federalism is there, and I think, you know, the power is potentially coming this way. Yeah.
So this could be an opportunity, even though it looks like a lot of people are really losing hope.
Yeah, I think federalism gives you some hope.
Good. Peter Helland, David Wemhoff on the show Israel, and Dave, you already pointed out your book there.
Yeah, 2-volume, John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, the American Proposition. Get it on Amazon. Thank you very much.
Okay, good enough. We'll probably try to put something underneath. So until next time, God bless.